Hello, I am the one, the only, not quite as high as you'd like to be, but definitely as mighty, and only, Phineas 12 Gauge. This is the Apostate Seminary, and today is a very special part 1 of Theocracy, Theonomy, and you. So getting straight to the dirty nasty, when talking about the Christian right, there is a distinction to be made that is kind of semantic, but also is kind of important because words mean things, and if they don't, we can't communicate, and society breaks down, and everything burns. A theocracy, and honestly this is more their distinction than mine, is when a member of the priest class or wholly appointed and anointed kingly guy speaks for God and sets up shop as head of state. A theonomy is a civilization that doesn't necessarily have a government headed by a member of the priest class or otherwise chosen divinely by Creator God, but is otherwise run by God's rules. We'll be dealing largely with theonomy here because that's what allows this to have the major libertarian streak that it does. So, for the Christian right, this is where we're going to live. Traces of the religious right go back to the 1800s. In 1863, representatives from 11 Christian denominations in the United States organized the National Reform Association with the goal of adding a Christian amendment to the U.S. Constitution in order to establish the country as a Christian state. The National Reform Association is an organization from the late 1800s that tried to get in the Constitution that God is God and Jesus is Jesus and there's no morality or great American America without them. I can't find the exact wording because everybody seems to be adding and taking away from the Christian amendment, but that's the gist of it. And there have actually been multiple attempts to get a Christian amendment in the Constitution, and almost all of them keep failing, which is demonstrative of how Christian of a nation we live in. It is interesting to me to note, though, that kind of in line with these ideas, there is a quote from Benjamin Franklin, who was there at the founding of the country, I remind you, and that paints a different picture of what the early Americans thought they were doing. Quote, "If we look back into history for the character of the present sects in Christianity, we shall find few that not in their turns been persecutors and complainers of persecution. The primitive Christians thought persecution again extremely wrong in the pagans, but practiced it on one another. The first Protestants of the Church of England blamed persecution on the Romish Church, but practiced it upon the Puritans. These found it wrong in the bishops, but fell into the same practice themselves, both here and in New England." End quote. He was speaking from England at that point about the history of Christians going persecution happy, and in fact, America hasn't had any religious civil wars, which, given how many different religions we've had, and given the fact that there have been hate crimes and lynchings against people for just not following the right kind of Christianity, paints a picture that makes it a little weird we wouldn't have more fighting over religion. The persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in America is actually a big part of why it's been on the books so long that nobody can make you say the Pledge of Allegiance despite the fact that people can frown on it. So what are we supposed to credit with the fact that we haven't ripped the country apart over whether or not you have the right edition of your imaginary friend? We have, and currently are, trying to rip it apart over a lot of things, but not that. The readings I've done, and I agree, credit the country's history of religious pluralism, established by the founders to prevent the kind of persecution that these extremists want to establish here. Franklin wasn't alone. Either in Massachusetts, Congregationalists would execute and tax people who didn't accept their beliefs. This caused Baptists, which ironically are the backbone of the founding of the modern religious right, to call for separation of church and state. John Leland, the Baptist pastor and proponent of separation, opposed the establishments that led to the executions in Massachusetts, Virginia, and Connecticut. For Leland, America wasn't being founded to be a Christian nation, but should recognize the equality of all believers, saying, quote, "Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and see that one does not abuse another." End quote. He, according to the National Constitution Center, even mentioned Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians by name. Based on my knowledge of the world at that time, it seems pretty safe that when he says Turks, he means Muslims. So we're going to jump ahead 200 years now, because this is ostensibly an episode about the religious right as we're dealing with it today. In 1976, President Carter was elected in part due to his religious conversion, and was still a lot more liberal than the evangelicals at the time wanted. Jerry Falwell remarked, "Americans have literally stood by and watched as godless, spineless leaders have brought our nation floundering to the brink of death." In the backlash to Carter's liberal tendencies, Jerry Falwell told the evangelical community that they should get involved in politics. Apparently at the time they weren't politically active like they are today due to the Scopes Monkey trial. So the thing that they were slapping back against was that Carter talked about religion and Carter preached at Robert Maddox's church. Robert Maddox being a prominent preacher at the time. But then Carter put $4 billion towards public works packages, extended food stamps to 2.5 million more people, enlarged the earned income tax credit to low-income households, and expanded the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. Basically, he did stuff trying to help people, and Jesus never would have done that. That's the kind of wealth redistribution that the communists do, as we're still in the Red Scare. The way that they were going to get backlash was to latch on to abortion in the 80s by saying things like, the choice is to not have sex, which is an attitude that we've seen leads to higher rates of STI, higher rates of teen pregnancy, and higher abortion rates, predominantly in the South, where they cut way back on sex education and say things like, the choice is to not have sex. So the 70s, where Carter was president, was a tumultuous time. This is the 1970s in which 17 states had schools that were segregated, and from the pushback of the Civil Rights Act and the attempting to end segregation, whites had begun moving their students to private religious schools that were church-sponsored, and so they were trying to get a tax exemption for that. A scam that is continuing to this day. And it isn't particularly surprising to find that that didn't fly under the pro-integration Carter administration. When it was found that any organization that engages in segregation is not considered a charitable organization, the evangelicals were pissed, and it probably didn't help prevent this situation that Falwell had a segregation academy in Virginia. So Falwell, to found the religious right, the new right, was going to team up with Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich? Weyrich. This guy is who came up with the moral majority rhetoric and is why the moral majority organization is called what it is. He was also the role model of Jerry Falwell Jr. and Evil Universe Don Draper stand-in. Weyrich is also responsible for the Heritage Foundation and the Free Congress Foundation, both of which are organizations that can fuck themselves to dust. So a little bit of background on Weyrich and what the country looked like relevant to this episode. He got to DC in the 1960s and was a political activist in the 1970s. And this was a guy who was so far right that the 60s and 70s Republicans, reaching the height of the Red Scare and the pushback against communism and just recently getting In God We Trust on the money, needed that guy to cool the fuck down a little bit. The pushback against the sexual revolution, Red Menace, Russian atheists, Republicans thought this guy was a little too nutty. But being a little too nutty for them was the goal of the moral majority. The important one of Weyrich's ideological triplets, and the one applicable to this episode, was to take Ronald Reagan, a twice-married actor who signed a liberal abortion bill when he was California's governor with the mission of, to quote Reagan, making America great again. Because the stuff that is going on right now is just the religious right trying to incite the second coming of Reagan and then the second coming of Jesus. Although it is pretty clear that when Reagan declared MAGA, what he was referring to is pre-Carter, which is nothing too familiar to now if you really think, oh shit, Trump is just trying to pre-Obama the country, isn't he? You know, we're just living in the 80s, but we don't have the TVs being perfectly out of focus to appear quaint and campy. But what we do have now that they had then is plenty of televangelists. And televangelism was used as the base with which they launched the creation of the modern religious right, with James Robison declaring at the Evangelical Religious Roundtable that God's people need to come out of the closet, and Reagan saying that even though they cannot endorse him, he endorses them. So Jerry Falwell described the plan of the movement that he was creating as get them saved, get them baptized, and get them registered to vote. I prefer the atheist three-step plan, get them educated, get them politically engaged, and get them registered to vote, but that might just be my preferences. And part of what Falwell was using to try and get them to register to vote was preaching about abortion, which, according to Jerry Falwell, he didn't actually do until 1978. Which means that at 45 years old, all of a sudden this was important enough for the pulpit. And he used that to get the evangelical right mobilized because, remember, the evangelicals at this point hadn't really been active since the Scopes Monkey trial, which had been decided in 1925. And this all became a lot more accessible to them in 1988 when Pat Robertson ran for president, which, while Ralph Reed, the chairman of the Christian Coalition, described as the political crucible that led to the proliferation of Christian right groups. But in August of that year, there was a child born who would change the world. And near that child, I was born, and they had to begin preparing for what I would bring forth. So, to summarize so far, the founders wanted us to be a pluralist society. There were racists. Jimmy Carter wasn't Christianing and bigoting hard enough. Falwell started preaching about abortion, almost lost his racist-ass school, used abortion to try and keep his racist-ass school, and then Reagan made us great again, and then I was born. And then, continuing in the 1980s, Gary DeMar founded American Vision, which is one of the groups pushing the doctrine of Christian Reconstruction, which is where people get the dumbass idea that America was founded as a Christian nation, and we should get rid of all this fucking democracy and goddamn act like it. Christian Reconstructionism as a movement was founded by R.J. Rushdoony, who looks like Evil Universe James Randi. More on him another time. So American Vision has the goal to restore America's biblical foundation, and part of that is backing the death penalty for homosexuals. Which, they also believe that Jane Fonda is the queen of leftism, which I have nothing against Jane Fonda. I'm sure she's very nice, and I appreciate the decades-long run of political activism that she's had, but declaring her queen, Lady King, I guess, is a little much. They hold the view that Democrats are all godless atheists who want to destroy Jesus, although they now have an article about how the left is suddenly okay with people being religious as long as you're a Democrat, because they're so disconnected from reality that they don't realize the Democrats really don't give a fuck about atheists. And that it probably doesn't read as well after the "it's okay to be black in South Carolina as long as you're a Republican" shit from Lindsey Graham. Presumably, they also think that all those whiny feminist bitches should take off their shoes, get knocked up, and get their asses back in the kitchen. The usual fucking Christian religious bullshit law stuff. You know. Now, to DeMar's whatever the opposite of credit is, he did say that under the extremist Christian government our founding fathers envisioned, not all homosexuals would be killed, but that occasional execution of sodomites would be good for society. The law, he says, requires the death penalty for homosexual acts, effectively driving the perversion of homosexuality underground back into the closet. Now, Joel McDermott, former president of American Vision, or current president of American Vision, depending who you ask, added onto that shitbag of a viewpoint that if a society is Christian, it's biblical. And if it's biblical, then the execution of the gays needs to be in place. So, since then, DeMar and McDermott have been on one. Gary DeMar popped up to keep on with his insane nonsense, still proclaiming that homosexuals aren't content with only having the bedroom. That perversion is taken into the classrooms, teaching that such practices are normal, and saying there is nothing normal about what homosexuals do, because really at the root of this, remember, this spawned out of segregation. This spawned out of Jerry Falwell being afraid he wouldn't be able to keep his segregationist school. This really is, and always has been, about how limiting bigotry is Christian persecution. So in 2010, because currently on Amazing Things that Gary DeMar have said, he said that a long-term goal of Christians should be executing the people who provide or have abortions, and that the long-term goal of Islam is to abolish our constitutional freedoms. You know, the ones he thinks we should get rid of because of Jesus? It kind of seems like if the Muslims really do want to abolish our constitutional freedoms, which makes sense, we had those 600 years ago, it should probably be like an enemy of my enemy kind of situation. So in more recent history, McDermott has been trying to garner support for president. If I destroy America, Joel McDermott can fuck a Bible in the public square while the gays are beheaded with lawn equipment and nobody can stop him, Trump, which at this point I think really says all we need to say about McDermott. So he and they are part of that kind of religious right. And this is the religious right that talked about criminalizing abortion and talked about what God wanted a literal dozen plus times in the opening bit of the Republican platform statement in 2016, which in 2020 just kind of switched over to "I'm with stupid." And that brings us to where their power comes from, where that political power comes from. Their power is attributed to the fact that they vote, like you should have done for Hillary Clinton. The voters that are part of the Christian right are very motivated about the issues they care about because they've been tricked into thinking that God is real and cares about those things that he never actually weighed in on if he is real, and that God will be very angry at them if they don't fight to control society to make sure that these things don't happen. This is the same reason that they're willing to volunteer to work for political parties. When you believe God will be mad if you don't need to get paid. So all of that volunteering really helps on saving fundraising money. And the turnout has been and continues to be with these people huge. George W. Bush was helped a lot in 2000 by getting 68% of the evangelical vote and 78% in 2004. In 2016, Donald Trump got 81% of the evangelical vote because doing the right thing is nothing compared to not making your imaginary friend sad. And these last 4 years were supposed to be their utopia. Jerry Falwell Jr. said that watching Donald Trump get elected was like watching history repeating itself. It's just his dad's playbook that was still in use and they just Reaganed it up. Oddly, the use of Reagan and Trump, who don't live up to their professed ethical standards, have caused the criticism that it's taken the religious group and turned it into just another constituency instead of a religious movement, and that it's full of hypocrites, and confuses me because I thought that was the point. Now, the belief on the Christian right, the things that they're outspoken on, is fucking marriage and abortion, school prayer, intelligent design, embryonic stem cell research, temperance, euthanasia, contraception, Christian nationalism, Sunday Sabbatarianism, sex education, and pornography. And most of those are going to be tackled in turn. So the modern views on sex are a return to the 1950s, because sex is scary and having it, and being free to have it, is a threat to the fabric of the American family and American society. In the 60s, they all got very scared, and so they started pushing back on the concept of having sex in the 1970s, because when you're scared, you start controlling people's crotch if you're a middle-class white person. I'm a lower middle-class white person, so when I get scared, I just focus on controlling women. And this fuck fear was spurned on by the gay rights movement and the passing of Roe v. Wade, or on-demand abortion, which they like saying, which makes me hope hell is real and theirs is being CEO of abortion Netflix, and they can't help but succeed and grow their customer base of abortion havers, like David Lynch directing a fever dream mashup of The Producers and The Life Zone. And it was during these points in the 1980s that the conservatives got all weird and sex-obsessed. Although they were probably always sex-obsessed, but they were just not shutting the fuck up about it now. They weren't taken seriously at this point, so they stepped back and organized, like you do when your crazy fascist movement isn't taken seriously, and they came out with firm positions against abortion, pornography, sexual deviancy, and extreme feminism. Oddly enough, they haven't mentioned sexual immorality much since Donald Trump became president. So their views on gay marriage, or as they call it, the state forcing them to live in a world inhabited by people who are allowed to have sex without being stoned to death, because literally the only thing stopping us from having religious exemptions for Christian honor killings is the fact that atheists, brown people, and the educated tend to vote Democrat. And sometimes then only barely. And Christian conservatives are incapable of viewing marriage as anything other than a man and the dishwasher he fucks, which isn't great. And neither are their views on gay marriage. So some of the groups that are at the head of the anti-gay rights movement are Focus on the Family, the Family Research Council, and the Family Research Institute, because if you do everything possible to convince people family means straight, you can stop perfectly wonderful LGBT people from having one. Also, the Family Research Council is a SPLC-listed hate group, so that's nice. That's good company to be in. And they actually think that's good company to be in. Like, I really want that to be more sarcasm than it is. So they reject gay rights because they say that it is a rejection of the big brother government telling them who they can and can't hate, and so allows the government to profit from a general feeling of discontentment and demoralization with government, unless you aren't the worst. And this lets the Christian right try to pretend that trying to deny gay people the rights that they're entitled to as human beings is somehow the fight for smaller government. Because if government decides who government recognizes as people, why, maybe next you'll be wearing gophers as cock socks or something else fucking stupid that they completely made up. So when same-sex marriage was made legal in Massachusetts in 2004, it kind of kicked them into hyperdrive, and it allowed them to recruit members of their movement more heavily from the Black Christian community. A quick aside on this, the Black community is a diverse range of adherents to religious ideologies, and the idea that white people have very frequently of just Black people in Jesus church Jesusing and being represented consistently as one denomination or religious bloc is not representative of the big picture of what's going on in those communities. You know, like it usually isn't when your idea of people is based on media-painted racial schema. 14% of African Americans are evangelical Protestants, and while there is an overwhelming number of people who are Christian in those communities, just like every community in America, I'm talking about this particular 14% evangelical Christian sect. And those people are, according to the most recent surveys by Pew Research I could find on African American religious demographics, which admittedly comes from 2009, they are outnumbered in that community just by the number of non-Christians. Never mind the other types of Christian. The first point of all that is to say that these Jerry Falwell motherfuckers took advantage of homophobia to try and have a Black friend made up of 13% of the population to try and tokenize people to throw the scent off their racism. Or, as the president put it, hey, look at my African American over here. Because these fucking evangelical fuckers are a goddamn bigotry turducken. The second point is to say that they strengthened their position with interracial coalitions that hadn't existed previously. And I had been wondering about Black Trump supporters, given the fact that Trump has a long and seemingly proud history of being racist as fuck, but this kind of puts it in perspective for me. So, when you consider all the redlining Trump and the Trumps have done, all of the dog whistles, and the fact that the president is explicitly saying that they're coming for your suburbs, the religious right figured out way before I did that you can oppress people and then get those oppressed people to sign up to take part in the oppression of other people if you A, call it moral, and B, can use that to convince them that they are superior to other people. Once upon a time, LBJ, who had a very complicated relationship with race in America, said, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. Same pattern, but with different nouns. It's the same con with a different mark. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, the huge part of the Black community saw through the game, except for a sliver of people who bought into the extremism. And we see a reflection of that when we look at the demographics supporting non-discrimination laws around the time of Prop 8. And what we saw coming out of the Black community was that while the majority of people were uncomfortable with same-sex marriage, which was a view that was generally shared by the Christian community as a whole, the support for non-discrimination laws and just generally letting gay people live was on the right side of history. So this is a small group of people in that community that got duped into getting duped. And I know I'm probably laying this on a little heavy, but I do want to make it clear that there is stereotypes about homophobia in the Black community, and I'm not trying to appeal to those. I'm trying to say that there is a small amount of people on Team Jerry Falwell, and it seems that the gateway through to do that in the Christian conservative, evangelical right, dominionist playbook was gay marriage and taking advantage of feelings of discomfort and homophobia surrounding that. So I'm going to get off that and I'm going to move on to something less controversial. Their views on abortion. And their views on abortion and gender roles are just as stupid and bigoted and ignorant and dumb and are inextricably linked, make you no mistake about that. The reason I say that is because no abortion. At all. because what women are for is making babies. And when you allow abortion, you take away the obligation to make babies that was given by God, because one does not become, but is simply born a woman, if I may paraphrase Simone de Beauvoir, which I shouldn't, because this is the exact opposite thing that she was writing about in that book. But more to the point, when you look at the multi-Christian group People of Praise, and you look at Amy Coney Barrett, and you look at her saying things like abortion is always immoral, and the push to overturn Roe v. Wade coming out of the current Supreme Court, what you're seeing is the goal. Remember, these last 4 years were supposed to be their utopia, especially during the time where they controlled the entire government. So this agenda that we're seeing, this extreme shift to the right, has been the game explicitly and with this movement for almost 50 years, and a little less explicitly and through a variety of movements for the last 150. But abortion wasn't a big issue in the 1800s, and there's not much else to say about it. They want women to be incubators. As we talk about education and we talk about sex ed, it's going to become clear that the world they want is one that lends itself to an uptick in abortions, which is something they want to outlaw, something they want to criminalize. They want to criminalize women not just giving birth. So with education, they would like to have school vouchers so that religious schools can get funded by taxpayer money, a la Betsy DeVos. And I'm not okay with this. I'm super duper not. I would like just the shared truth we all live in to be taught in schools, because pay for your own indoctrinating your children into bullshit, because these vouchers would go to fund things like Trinity schools, set up by the totally not secret society cult overseen by a weird menagerie of types of Christianity as part of a ploy to institute a Christian theocracy that will be accelerated by the recent Supreme Court shitstir Amy Coney Barrett that was mentioned previously, and her group People of Praise, who my wife and I yelled about semi-coherently in episode 10. So, encapsulating evolution, sexual education, and homeschooling, and part of church-state separation, but that gets its own bullet point. With evolution, no evolution. The best case scenario is teaching evolutionary creationism, which is creationism but God-guided evolution. The middle case is teach the controversy, which the Discovery Institute is fond of, because then they get to make up controversies that don't actually exist. And the most insidious is evolution is lie made up by monkey fucking atheists we didn't come from. None of these are great. Evolution is a fact. When you get out of school, you should know that evolution is a series of facts, and the theory part is just the philosophical ideas that tie the facts together, not a whole bunch of guesses and then some nonsense to try and fill in the holes to make it make as much sense as possible. That's Brahmanology. For sex ed, no child of mine will be taught how to responsibly handle the fact that they and others have bodies and how to clean them or what things do or what things are called, says they. And for homeschooling, their view is generally one of, wait, you mean I can totally just teach Jesus in school if the school is in my house? Holy heckers checkers, yes. And I found a few big homeschooling organizations, but the Accelerated Christian Education Programs Wikipedia really lays out the damage. And I'm going with Wikipedia on this because Ace wanted money to see anything about what they do, and I'm not giving them any. If they want more say in what I say about them, they should be more transparent. Otherwise, I'm going to go with the shit talkers on Wikipedia. So, they are a biblical literalist organization from the 70s. They teach via rote recall, which is bad because that's not how people learn, and that's not why schools in America tend to teach that way anymore. They were or are, it's not really clear, apartheid apologists. Science class is Young Earth Creationism, in which the Loch Ness Monster is taught as a real thing that disproves evolution, and I will touch on why that is stupid bullshit nonsense in Brahmanology Part 2. They say the Civil War was started by God to punish religious apostasy. No word on whether having slavery, as it says, is totally chill in the Bible, or not having slavery, as it says, is totally chill in the Bible, is the apostasy part, but I'm guessing that because slavery is okay in the Bible, the North beat God. And B, that this podcast, because it is the apostate seminary and the whole project is powered by apostasy, is going to be the cause of the Second Civil War, where we will beat God in the name of right again. And back to them, they have been criticized for their portrayal of segregation, which I couldn't find anything on what that was, but that's not something you should have to be criticized for, as a rule. And Michael Rice of the University of London was quoted as saying, "My particular problem with ACE is the awful nature of the curriculum they provide to their students." And all of that is totally fine in the worldview of these backwards theocrats. And that was a running theme. They're not prepared for university, not prepared for the real world, because they're not being taught anything, especially on Sundays, because these groups practice and want to enforce Sunday Sabbatarianism, which is blue laws and certain restrictions on allowed activities on Sundays, because blah, 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 something about small government not interfering in people's lives. Next on the list is church-state separation. The idea of church-state separation was made up by the ACLU in order to stomp out religious freedoms of Christians, to not make America a Christian nation, and hunt down and execute apostates, heretics, and homosexuals like Spokane Representative Matt Shea wanted. There's also been an escalated push for religious liberty bills that would allow people, or because thanks to the Hobby Lobby decision, they can have religious beliefs too, businesses, to discriminate against LGBT people. Or because I'm assuming there won't be literal gaydars in the entranceway to buildings, anybody that doesn't fit their predefined ideas of what a man or woman should be. So it would essentially just be a legitimization for businesses and people to try and enforce their preconceived gender roles. In economics, they would like no government interference in the market, so we can go back to having lead in the paint, asbestos in the pipes, poison in the toys, and gunning down employees because they don't want to be paid in commissary tickets instead of money they can buy things with that isn't owned by the company that pays them, because that's what happens in the libertarian paradise of laissez-faire economics. It doesn't work. We did it and it doesn't fucking work. The current support of it is the ruling class convincing the people who are exploited that somehow they won't be more exploited if they're allowed to be exploited more. This topic is outside of the scope of this in large part, but it did warrant this brief touch on it, and pointing out that Jesus supported wealth distribution in addition to screaming trees to death and being rude to his mom. This is absolutely not a Christian idea. This is just libertarian elitism wanting permission to be able to exploit the working class more. And because it's looking over the views of economic policy is beyond the scope of what we're dealing with at the moment, moving on to the Middle East. And the views on the Middle East of the evangelical right are fucking terrifying. They are why securing a trade deal between three countries who aren't at war so we can sell them weapons are being heralded as bringing peace to the Middle East. Meanwhile, there's still war and there's still genocide in areas and there's still not peace in the Middle East. It's just that Israel and the U.S. have some new treaties together. Ed McAteer, who was involved in the founding of the Moral Majority, known for being Jerry Falwell's vehicle for this shit, was quoted as saying, "I believe that we are seeing prophecy unfold so rapidly and dramatically and wonderfully and, without exaggerating, makes me breathless." They believe that the second coming of Jesus has the establishment of the state of Israel as a prerequisite. This is why the aggressive blowing of Israel and the conflating of Zionism, a Jewish nationalist movement centering around the securing of that area of the Middle East for the state of Israel, with anti-Semitism. They need those two things to be the same so that God can come back with dragons and fucking waste everyone, and everyone who is against the more, shall we say, disagreeable things Netanyahu's government has done is against that, and so they have to hate Jews as a group. And as such, Christians, and as such, Jesus, and as such, people who want a two-state solution, or atheists, or people who just want the Palestinians to be able to live in the land that they live in without being harassed by foreign governments or harassed by Israel, or for, quite frankly, Israel to not be attacked in retaliation for things they may have done by Palestine, and for the whole area to settle down, for Iran to not be arming themselves with nuclear weapons. Basically, to actually have peace in the Middle East is a liberal snowflake, libtard, coward, dangerous anarchist with soup cans full of tuna. Moving past that, when it comes to the environment, they have a very, I can kick it to death if I want to because it's mine attitude. Their attitude towards drugs are basically just Elkmore City from Footloose, and will probably remain that way until a smoked out Kevin Bacon comes to save us. And to wrap up the list, and it may not particularly surprise you, they're not a big fan of porn or sex work in general, despite the weird frequency with which they get caught partaking of sex workers or doing weird porn shit. And that settles the list. Something that was interesting to me while I was going through all of this was a quote that also came from Wikipedia. Commenters from all sides of the aisle, such as Rob Schenck, Randall Balmer, and Charles M. Blow, criticized the Christian right for its tolerance and embrace of Donald Trump during the 2016 presidential election, despite Trump's failure to adhere to any of the principles advocated by the Christian right groups for decades. And this is one of those quotes that happens when you have a group of people who may or may not necessarily agree trying to just reach a point where people quit editing their edits. Is you reach nonsense like that. Because, like I've been talking about this whole fucking time, he didn't do the things they advocated, but everything from redlining to shitting on soldiers to betraying the country to pandering to God-fearing gun toters to trying to be a Ronald Reagan impersonator to appointing anti-choice judges while having his life saved by fucking stem cells to being a fascist and trying to destroy democracy while pandering to the evangelical Christian right is what the fuck these assholes were doing the whole time. You can look at him and you can say, okay, well, you're not doing the things that they advocated, but you're fighting the wrong fight because he's doing the things that they were doing. Although I guess it is nice to know that it doesn't fly for people who aren't theocratic Christian fascists, though, I guess. Hopefully it'll mean something and we'll get a Biden-Harris presidency. If it had occurred to you, though, during this, that Jesus was a social justice warrior, that what with his wealth redistribution and helping the poor talk, as apparently is a criticism of this, although I'm not sure I would call Jesus a social justice warrior, they respond by telling you that he was talking about personal obligation. He wasn't talking about some kind of terrible authoritarian democratic system made by Antifa BLM anarchists where we all pay into a pool and then use that pool to make sure everybody can eat and have health care as a team. That would be horrible, says they, for some reason. And just as a note before I close this episode out, there's going to be another one of these, and it's going to be dealing more directly with the philosophy that's developed around this, specifically with a guy named Stephen Palmquist. And that's all going to be in the show notes, and it's going to be 12B. And it's all going to get released as 12. The reason for staying on this is because more and more theocracy is on the ballot. My whole life, until I was an adult, I didn't realize that there had been a conservatism that wasn't hyper-religious. I was raised in a very evangelical style household, and for me it was always you voted Republican because otherwise God would be mad. I didn't realize there was some better time where that wasn't the case until I was an adult. And by the time I was an adult, Obama was in office and the Tea Party was lynching him in effigy in the streets. So during my life, and I'm sure for the Americans listening to this, for your life, it's always been theocracy on the ballot. And theocracy shouldn't be on the ballot in the first place, because something that Benjamin Franklin knew and Thomas Jefferson knew is that horrible things being done to people with the government standing back or the government advocating it is a problem of religion. When you're an atheist, you hear a lot that, Islam is uniquely dangerous, but when you actually sit and you look at what does the right want? What does the extreme right want? What do these religious fundamentalists want? It becomes clear that what's stopping them is not the unique issues present in Islam. What's stopping them is us. What's stopping them is atheists who have the decency to vote against them. What's stopping them is Muslims who have the decency to vote against them. Other Christians who have the decency to vote against them. That is what's stopping gays being thrown off of buildings. That's what's stopping women being punished for being raped. Because here's the thing. We're one step away from honor killings. We're one step away in this country from the things that people like to pretend is uniquely Muslim because they heard about Charlie Hebdo. And what happened to him was terrible. But what happens to children who are killed due to punishments because they don't memorize Bible verses? What happens at purity balls? What happens at, a while back, there was reports that people were meeting up and just trading children into marriage in Kansas. All of these things aren't Muslim. Those are all Christian phenomena, and they're all terrible. And that's what we're going towards, because people are so hung up on the new atheist post 9/11 anti-Muslim rhetoric that they sometimes forget to stop and go, what is stopping us from becoming that? Because religion poisons everything, and it's currently poisoning government, and it's currently poisoning America, and it's currently causing us to die. The antidote is to speak out against theocracy. The antidote is to not pretend that Donald Trump isn't the same as Bashar al-Assad, is to not pretend that Mike Pence isn't the same as Ayatollah Khomeini, is to not pretend that we won't end up with women back to being second-class citizens, to black and brown people being back to being second-class citizens, to gays being killed because we're watching power slip to this evangelical group that wants these things. Theocracy is on the ballot. It's been on the ballot my whole life. It was introduced in a major way with Ronald Reagan. I was born during George H.W. Bush. My whole life, it's been there. When I was a child, I watched our president say he was chosen by God to be the decider. It's always been there, and we've always pretended like it's not. And then my whole adult life, we've all been so focused on Islam that we have watched it slip until Donald Trump happened, until Mike Pence became our vice president, until religious fundamentalists and religious extremists who are linked to these groups with Jerry Falwell took power to be able to shape our laws and be able to shape our constitutions and pretend that that doesn't make them judicial activists because they're knights and warriors of some higher order. Theocracy is on the ballot and always has been. And when theocracy is on the ballot, we have to activate. We have to become political. There needs to be more voices of ours. People who are able need to become politicians. They need to run for office. They need to get involved in the system. When theocracy is on the ballot, reason needs to be on the ballot, and we're not going to get to reason through Joe fucking Biden. Vote for Biden. I'm Phineas 12 Gauge. This has been the Apostate Seminary Poli-Sci edition. Next time we'll be examining this some more. The Twitter is the letter X, Essential Panda. The link to the store will be in the show notes. The show's Twitter is Apostasy Powered, and the email, in case you want to send praise and glory or prayers or deletable or nice thoughts or feedback or suggestions or just need to vent and get stuff off your chest, is poweredbyapostasy@gmail.com. Stay safe, stay inside, vote blue down the ticket. I wonder if Trump's executive order not to enforce the Johnson Amendment would apply to an atheist 501c3.